to make sure the red light comes on. There it is. Now it says we're recording. Hey, yeah, man, I'm so thankful to get to hang out with some really special people for me tonight. These are folks that deal with this every day. They deal with their patients and people who struggle in the various topics that we're talking about through this series, What Lies Beneath, here at Life Point. And it's been a great privilege for me to get to introduce y'all to these folks and to kind of further the conversation that we've had on Sunday mornings. As Nate often says, he can't unpack all this in his 30 minutes on a Sunday morning, but we're able to take some time, talk to some professionals, and really dive a little below the surface on these topics. So it's my great privilege to get to introduce you all to Dr. David Hatmaker. He's here with us, so thank you, Doctor. I have Rachel Yao, a special friend of our family and a licensed counselor that we're so excited to have here. And then Laura Layton, who's a friend of mine and again, a therapist that has such a tender heart for people. I'm just glad she can be here with us tonight too. So this is such a treat for me. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to those guys because they're the smart ones. I think Dr. Dave is going to kick it off for us. So if you'll get us going here, Doc.
Well, I first of all wanted to follow up on what Pastor Nate said on Sunday. He talked about potholes. Now, all of us living in South Carolina know and deal with potholes all the time. So we're very familiar with that subject. We know a little bit about that, but that was such a great illustration to help us to see how anger can be. It's something that can be maybe so small that can cause such damage. And I think as we begin to look at this, we realize that life happens, all kinds of stressors, things that are just maybe underneath the surface a little bit. But when a small crack forms, just like in a pothole, if it's left unattended, then I will be open to and possibly into more of an anger, resentment, bitterness, even leading to depression. So one of the things that I thought was very important that he also said about potholes, the great stories of potholes, but one of the great things that he said that I thought was so apropos is that potholes don't fix themselves.
Oh, yeah.
And anger, repressed anger, doesn't just get better on its own. If I want to do something different, I've got to make some changes. I have to do something different if I want to see different results. If I want to keep doing the same thing, I just keep pushing replay, just like he said. But the key thing that we need to understand about anger is that anger comes a lot of times with things like people just blow up out of nowhere sometimes. And where did that come from? Well, as we begin to see and begin to understand a little bit more, we can understand that our feelings sometimes get repressed, especially when we're growing up. If we live in a home where there's an abusive situation, any kind of strong feelings of emotion, avoidance, displeasure, hostility, those kind of things can cause us to have a sense of fear, and we just keep quiet, don't say anything. And then we bring these little children inside our adult bodies into our lives as adults. And those little children act out periodically. And if they have never dealt with those issues, if they've never dealt with the hurt and the pain and the things that are from childhood, those will show up in behaviors, in things that I don't know why it's happening, but I begin to overreact to certain things that are irritants or things that bother me, things that come inside of me that come out in this rage, and I don't even know why it's happening. But certain triggers, certain sights, smells, tastes, sounds can all bring that to bear, and without really me understanding why. Sometimes I have to go deep and understand more of why this occurs. Laura deals a lot with marriage anger. And Laura, share with us a little bit of how this is affected in marriage situations.
David, just like you were saying, there's things we don't even recognize, the things that we learned in childhood. Example, a lot of times anger is tied to some repressed sadness or grief, and you received the message in childhood that that was something that would cause you to be rejected if you showed that emotion.
Absolutely.
Classic example is the little boy who's told that, you know, boys don't cry.
Mm-hmm.
And now boys have to figure out, well, what do I do with my sadness and my grief and my sense of rejection? And what happens is it becomes this fear of rejection often, or a number of other things that show up really big in their marriages, when they feel a little bit of criticism and it triggers this fear. The only way that's become acceptable to respond, the only way that they understand how to respond is either to pull away from it, or to explode.
Exactly.
And so we see those that show up a lot in marriage.
Yeah.
It's not always the man, but culturally, probably 80% of the time it is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Bob, you laugh about that.
It's my story. It's my story. It's so true, you know, so I totally relate with it. Yeah.
One of the things that is so important, I think, to understand is the biology or the physiology behind anger. Anger is a lot like the fight or flight. You get in a situation, your body actually goes into a state of alarm. And if you imagine when adrenaline and other chemicals are pumped into your bloodstream, the heart pumps faster, the blood pressure rises, the blood flow, it quickens, your muscles tense. If you could imagine having this happen to you over a long period of time, your body begins to break down. This is a lot of times what causes depression, because the body shuts down and says, I've had enough. That's it. I can't deal with it anymore. And this is what happens if I'm so angry about something, I'm so intense about it, I feel this gnawing, I just can't let it go, because if I let it go, then they're off the hook. They're off scot-free. They don't have to pay anything. But that's
You owe me.
Yeah, you owe me. We're going to get to that one too. But yeah, you owe me. It's almost like you drinking a bottle of poison, expecting that person to die.
Yeah.
It's like that, and you're the one that's going to die, not them. But that's I just wanted to talk a little bit about that rage and the physiological aspects of what happens to us inside when we are really angry and rageful. Rachel talks about abuse with children and spouses. And this is very important to understand how all of this corresponds and is connected with this kind of rage.
Thanks, Dr. David. Yes, that's been my population. I actually started out my career working with teenagers in lockup. So they had been locked up because they had been being unsafe for society, and they were only teenagers. And for whatever reason, I thought, my underdeveloped brain thought that would be a great job to take on first thing.
Yeah.
Jesus, take the wheel. And so that was what I ended up working with first off. And that led into a really cool career where I'm now really very specialized in trauma. And so I think when you think of anger as sort of this pothole, unfortunately, where I encounter people ends up being where it's a volcano. There's something under the surface, but it's a mountain of trauma so much, and it's this lava constantly informing everything people are doing. Their neural pathways have, been charged to immediately react and respond. And when I worked with these teenagers, what I ended up saying was, anger is a shield emotion. Anger keeps us safe when we don't feel safe. And so kind of like what Dr. David was saying, that fight, flight, freeze, appease trauma response that we have, anger is kind of that fight part. And sometimes the appease part of, I just want to stay safe. And when we're focused on staying safe, what we're definitely not focused on is the other person, their safety, their well-being, their emotions, or what's happening with them, whether we like that or not. And so working with those populations, I've seen just this rage boil up and become volcanic. And sometimes, I've actually worked with folks who have had their children removed. I used to be contracted with DSS in Missouri. And when folks had their children removed because of the rage that they had committed against their children, they had this very shameful and humiliating experience of being mandated to come to counseling. And they got to see me. Working with them, a lot of times they did not want to come in. They didn't want to work on it, but really they didn't want to admit to me that they were struggling with this because what would I think? And there's so much shame that can sometimes underlie anger. And if they admitted that they were struggling with that, then what? But they had to admit it because, it was all in the paperwork. And so I ended up just sitting across from them. And when somebody is sharing that they have anger, when somebody is admitting, gosh, I've struggled with this, being able to approach that, obviously there's a safety component. If you are in a situation where somebody is abusing you, there's rage, there's sometimes high lethality, meaning like somebody is so abusive that you're unsafe, get out of that situation until they can get their anger under control. That is not a situation to stay in. Get out of that situation. Even if you really love them, even if Jesus loves them, it's okay to get out of that situation and stay safe. I know Nate has shared that too. We definitely are here as a church to support you in that. But if somebody has been struggling with anger and they're not currently dangerous, being able to sit across from somebody and say, I'm not here to judge you. I'm not here to tell you that you've messed up and you can never be forgiven. I'm just here to listen and be there for you. That was really life-changing for a lot of those parents who had lost their kids. And a lot of them ended up being reunified with their kids and being able to be safe with their children once they worked through what was often a pretty significant trauma history that had led to these rage, volcanic kind of outbursts. So,
and what Rachel is saying also has to do with repressed feelings. When I repress my feelings and I keep doing this, and this unprocessed anger, it's going to eventually flip up and become rage, because I have basically thought about, ruminated. I mentioned in our last video that I recorded about a bird flying over your head. Well, you can't help a bird flying over your head, but you don't have to let him build a nest. So therefore, if I sit and I ruminate about the hurt and the pain that somebody's caused me, or how they've hurt me in some ways, then that's going to grow. And as that grows, that rage and those feelings will grow, and those type of feelings will begin to explode and cause me all kinds of issues in my relationships with people, with my spouse, with children, and everybody else. So many people have problems with repressed feelings because it wasn't safe to share those feelings. The only feelings that they were allowed to really share, and they really weren't allowed to share that, but they saw it, was anger, rage. They saw this growing up, maybe in their household, but they weren't really, it wasn't a safe environment in which to share their feelings. So many guys, ladies too, but many people that I work with have never been able to really open up and share those feelings. And when once they are able to process those feelings, the hurt, the pain, then things begin to calm down a little bit. It's kind of like when it gets ready to rain outside. My gosh, you see all of this storm clouds start to build and build and build. And then boom, there goes the explosion, there goes the rain, it comes down and things calm down. Kind of, the clouds just drift away. It's the same type of dynamic with anger, in the sense that you got hurt, you feel like somebody owes you, and you're going to make them pay. And sometimes, and a lot of times, even godly people are angry with God.
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
They're
yeah.
angry with God. They have their anger is directed toward God. God, you owe me. You owe
Yeah.
me for this that you took, or this thing, or this thing. And a lot of times also I found that the way I feel about a dysfunctional parent particularly reflects the way that I unconsciously feel about God.
Mm.
And that's not fair to God, but that's the way we feel.
That's what we do.
And
Yeah.
it's not based on truth of who God really is, but it's how our feelings are. And our feelings are very powerful. And, you know, as they are not healed, they grow, they intensify. And then we have a tendency to lash out and hurt, because hurting people do what?
Hurt people.
Feel. Exactly.
So true.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, well, this is so much of my story, you guys. I mean, listening to Laura talk about marriage and stuff like that. I mean, I grew up in a home where people just yell at each other. Uh, but then I marry a gal where that was not the case. So when I come, expressing all my emotion at full throttle, that was very uncomfortable for her, to the point that she felt abuse from it. Not that I was abusive, but that it felt abuse because she had never experienced
Mhm.
that. Now, when she met my family, she realized, oh, that they're just all that way. But at the same time, I knew that I had to take care of that, because it would go to the point of rage. And I think, Dr. David, you were mentioning that feeling that builds up inside of you, and I could feel it just crawl under my skin and build up in me, to the point where I just had to, I would explode. And unfortunately, she'd be on the other end of, again, that just loudness and just absolute anger and stuff. And so I had to begin to ask myself the question, why was I so angry? Why was it? And I just kept drilling down till I learned about things like hurt from my past, the fear, which oftentimes was, I just don't have an answer for her, and she wants an answer. And so out of that fear of not knowing how to answer, it was just anger would come out, which really was my insecurity, which is my identity. And it, fortunately, through discipleship and stuff, and counseling, I was able to kind of land my identity in Christ, but then also know that God had me. And I didn't have to defend every conversation, and God was my defense. And it just changed it. And now, yeah, I can still feel those moments, but I don't have to use those moments. I can choose to go for a walk. I can choose to go to God. I can choose to vent in another way, so that I can have a good conversation with my wife. She appreciates it, and I certainly appreciate what it's done for me.
I'm sure she does.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for
You-
sharing that,
Yeah,
Bob. That's
yeah.
your story is not an uncommon story.
Yeah.
And I think, unfortunately, so many people weren't taught the tools to understand what is going on beneath the surface, that it really takes a purposeful effort to do that. And it takes a lot of bravery to do that. A lot of people don't understand the amount of courage it takes to ask somebody else into your story. And it doesn't even have to be a professional counselor, but just
Right.
to invite somebody else into your story. And I think that's why the church is so big on community and life groups. Is
Absolutely.
you can just find that safe place to invite somebody in and start exploring what's under the surface.
Mhm.
Then you can find this place where your identity becomes more solid in Christ. You can find this place where you can know God as your defender, and that's freedom. You don't have to go defending yourself when you understand that you have a defender.
Yeah.
And to David's point about the people, so many people carrying anger towards God. And if we look all through the Psalms, David talked about that in the Psalms.
Yeah.
Upset with God. But I think in church, sometimes we get a message that that's not okay. So even though our feelings say we're upset with God, our brain tells us that's not okay. And it creates this place where we can't worship in spirit and in truth.
And I think we don't typically
That's
get
great.
things where there's not connection. And so I think sometimes I tell clients and people in my own life and myself, sometimes if we're feeling some anger towards God, there's probably a vulnerable emotion that needs to be expressed. I mean, I love what you shared, Bob, because underneath the surface of anger is those vulnerable emotions that you were willing to go to and say, you know, I felt insecure, I felt afraid or uncertain. And that's typically what is underlying anger, is those vulnerable emotions. But what's funny is anger is a disconnecting emotion. It disconnects us from the people around us.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Vulnerability is connecting. And so when we're
Yeah.
willing to go under the surface to those emotions that are more connecting, then we can connect in life groups or with mentors or peers or counselors or pastors or whoever it is that we're vulnerable.
God.
And mostly God.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and when I could tell Michelle, hey, look, when I could tell Michelle, hey, look, I'm just afraid. I just don't have an answer for you, and be willing to admit that. That, you know, that was the hardest part, was being, you know, I'm supposed to have the man. I'm supposed to be the man. I'm supposed to have the answer. But, you know, so here I was having to go, I just don't have an answer for it. I don't know what to do, frankly. And to be willing to say that out loud really changed everything. And as you talked about, it actually draws each other. It caused greater intimacy between us. We were drawn together, those kind of things. So I know before we hopped on the call, Rachel, you talked about, you know, there is danger out there for people to find themselves in violent situations and stuff. So could you kind of address that? And, you know, when do we enable a bad pattern, or, you know, do we have to forgive everybody all the time, you know, on this, or, you know, could you maybe speak to that a little bit?
Absolutely. Thank you for mentioning that, Bob. And I've had the pleasure and the challenge of working with the domestic violence and sexual assault populations and with child abuse. And a lot of times there's a lot of danger in being in a situation where somebody has unbridled anger. They haven't dealt with their things. And what I can say is, if you're in a situation where somebody in your life is expressing anger in a dangerous way with weapons, if somebody is doing things like choking or holding you against things or trapping you in some way, if somebody is threatening to hurt you in some way or is physically hurting you in some way, there's places in York County, the domestic violence shelter is Safe Passage. In Mecklenburg County, the domestic violence shelter is Safe Alliance. Those places serve both men and women. Certainly, if there's a child abuse situation, it's possible to call the mandated reporter hotlines. If somebody is unsafe and potentially could die, it's important to get into a safe situation and allow God and potentially some professionals with God to help that person who's experiencing anger. Sometimes the person who's experiencing anger doesn't want help yet. They're not ready to do that vulnerable work of going there, and they can become very dangerous. And people die all the time at the hands of people who become dangerous and are not willing to do their work. And so we talk about this cycle of abuse where people are very abusive in whatever their actions are. And then they go into a honeymoon period where they're like, oh, I'm going to change, but there's no actual action towards change. It's just to kind of pull that person back in. And then they go back into this rising tension period and then to the abusive period. And so if you're caught in that cycle of abuse with somebody, it is not your job to fix them. You cannot fix them and get out of that situation until they've really come to a space where they want to do that work. And God can break somebody's heart. God can change somebody, but I've always told people, you can't. You know, none of us, we can't change anyone. And they can't do it for us.
100%.
Yeah.
One of the things that I'm really concerned about is this area of forgiveness. You know, the Bible tells us to forgive as Christ has forgiven us. But I want people to understand forgiveness it starts with a volitional choice, but it's a process. It's not an instantaneous thing that immediately I have forgiven this person and I'm moving on. Well, when you do that, most of the time you're going from A to C and you miss B. And it's important to go through the steps, because as you do this, it creates a certain amount of healing and it allows the freedom for you to really to move on and eventually be able to say, you owe me nothing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Before we close, I think one of the things that's very important for us to do as a team tonight, people, is for us to give the audience, whomever is viewing this video, some steps or some ways to help with their anger. You know, people are always looking for ways to help. Yes, we've talked about professional counseling, therapy. We've talked about talking with safe people, but there are some things that we can do. We kind of call them Band-Aids that can help people. You know, with children, we give them timeouts because they're out of control. They need to think about what they're getting ready to say, or the behavior that they're getting ready to do or have done. And we as adults have to take timeouts as well to think about what it is that we're about to do and realize I have a choice here. Even though the feeling is strong, it's powerful, I still have a choice. I can verbalize my feelings. I can look for targets. I can look for triggers. You know, we need to be aware of triggers, things that really trigger us, cause us to really move quickly from a 0 to 100. And some of it may be traffic.
Live television. No.
But whatever the triggers are, we need to be aware of those, and we need to learn some more constructive alternative ways of handling our anger. So I would suggest at this point we kind of go back and forth of some things that we've told our clients or things that we've suggested to do to help in creating this way of helping an individual who wants to put some Band-Aids, control some of their anger, emotions, or actions. Ladies?
I can start off, David. In working with clients, and Laura has an idea, I can see it.
No, I just thought it out. Anyway, go ahead.
Well, in working with clients, something that I've often said is to kind of plan your intentions. And so if the first time that we're trying to deal with anger is when we're angry, it's not going to go well. And so in advance,
I love that.
I'm going to get angry. We live in kind of an anger avoidant culture where we all try to pretend like we don't get angry. And I love how
Sorry, you cut out on us there, Rachel.
No, that's okay. We have unstable internet connection.
No. So if you could repeat that though for us, that'd be really great.
That's okay. Something that I've talked with clients about is to decide in advance, how far am I willing to go to get my point across? And if we really kind of think about that, am I willing to yell? Am I willing to cuss at somebody? Am I willing to put my hands on somebody? Am I willing to hit somebody? Like, how far am I willing to go? Am I willing to demean somebody, or am I willing to attack their character? And the reality is, if we can decide in advance, how far am I willing to go? How far would Jesus want me to go to get my point across? And having some intention around that, I think, can be really helpful.
Yeah, I like that a lot. That was really good. Yeah, I think of, you know, something I tell people all the time: plan ahead of time before you get into the storm. So it's similar to that you have to decide ahead of time how you're going to respond. A lot of times my anger comes from unmet expectations. So I have created an expectation, it didn't go my way, now I'm angry, you know. So I have to always keep that in check.
Well, it's time to take a time out. When you start feeling those tense muscles, when you start feeling that frustration, that maybe you start the sarcasm, try to identify the cause. What's really causing me to do this? And then decide what to do. Resolve, don't repress. And I want to say one other thing about, when does a person need to get help professionally? Well, if they're having anger issues very often, frequently, that's a good time. It's also when I have trouble communicating my angry feelings constructively, that's another good time. Those are some good ways to know when I really, really need some extra help.
Yeah.
And not just for the sake of the people around us and the relationships that are hurt by it, but even just for our own, you know, mental, emotional, and also physical health. There's a lot of research, physical health implications of carrying bitterness and unforgiveness, anger. There's a lot of damage that's done to the organs, even from the high level of cortisol that those emotions create.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, so we're getting to be about that time. And did you guys have anything else you'd add before we kind of wrap things up? I'm going to give a couple resources to look at in addition, but anybody else? Do you have more? We lose Doctor.
I think we might have lost him.
So,
It happens. Internet is so tricky. Technology is
Yeah.
great.
oh, there he is.
You know, Bob, there's something about Isaiah 61 that speaks to me about really everything emotional, but you know, if we don't grieve and mourn, then we don't come to know Christ as our comforter and our provider in that. And underlying anger and so many of the other, you know, depression, anxiety, addictions, so often there's things that we need to mourn.
Yes.
And our culture is really bad about being okay with people grieving. So learning how to grieve and bring that to Jesus, and that might just look like being on your hands and knees or your face on the rug in your closet, and pouring out your heart there is where you meet him in the place where he can begin to heal.
Absolutely. Which reminds me of a couple great resources. You know, one I know you're very familiar with, both you, Rachel and Laura, is that Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, and then Pete Scazzero's latest book, Emotionally Healthy Discipleship. Both of those talk about that, about grief and mourning, and you know, oftentimes that's the step we skip, and now it turns into anger somewhere down the road, or something like that. But there's others. There's Chip Ingram did one called Emotions That Destroy. Very good one. It's a book. It's also available on Right Now Media. Andy Stanley, which this was a helpful book for me. It was called Enemies of the Heart, or The Enemy Within. It was the original title, but it's called Enemies of the Heart. And again, it talked a lot about what Nate talked about. It's those heart issues, those hurts, those fears, those things that come, and somebody owes me, God owes me, those kind of things that contribute to that. And then the book that Nate's been using for the series is Grace and Addiction, which is a really good book by Gerald May. So I want to make sure I reminded people of those things. But you know, as we've been talking about, the important thing is that if this is a repeated pattern for you, you know, if your spouse says, you know, you're angry, it's time to listen to your spouse. So get some help, you know, so especially if there's other people telling you the same. So please get some help. You know, I think it's scriptural to get help. You know, I really think there's a lot behind that passage. Don't let the sun go down on your anger. I think it's kind of a cue to go get some help. And again, the other tool that Laura mentioned earlier, which I'm so thankful for because I oversee life groups, is, you know, the importance of community. Man, I'm reading so much, particularly after this year of isolation and hibernation and everything that we've done. Man, they are just finding the damage done by the lack of community, the fact that we have been isolated from others, has really done a lot of damage that we have yet to see. And it's going to cause not just mental health, but physical health, spiritual health damage down the road. So we really believe that one of the most important things you can do for yourself is find a community. And it doesn't have to be a large life group. Some people aren't ready to jump into a room with 10, 12, 16 people. But man, maybe they have 1, 2, 3, I'm saying we're looking at micro groups, the idea of doing groups of 3 to 6 people. Go have coffee, but begin to talk about your fears, your doubts, those things that sometimes often land behind anger, those insecurities that we get out there.
Yeah.
But I'm going to give you guys the last voice. I got my resources out there. Anything else you'd say just to close us out?
Something that just came to mind, Bob, is I've often said, especially when I worked with teenagers, that conflict plus resolution equals intimacy. And really anger is conflict within ourselves that's not addressed. And so if
Wow,
we
that's
really can resolve that conflict, I think we can feel close within ourselves, but also with God and with others.
oh, that's so good. Yeah, that's a great way to close it out, Rachel. Guys, thank you so much. This has been such a treat spending time with you. I think it's going to be one of the, well, I think they've all been good actually, but just a great contribution. Anger is such a tough one. And again, for me, I didn't see it because it's what I grew up with, and I think that's the case for many too. Is they just don't realize the damage they're doing, like a pothole, to bring it all the way back around. You just sometimes don't realize the damage you've done till somebody hits that pothole the umpteenth time, and you've now destroyed a vehicle. But now I'm losing it. But anyway, thank you guys. I love you guys. Thank you for taking this time out on a Monday night. Love you.
Love you,
Thanks,
Bob.
Bob. Love you too.
Oh. All right. I am going to